From the earliest days of our formation and all throughout our life's journey, we are doomed to face tragedy, many afflictions, and great tribulations. Only these are guaranteed to all mankind, from birth and beyond, no matter a person's status. Some more than others, but nonetheless, we are destined to experience pain in many different ways. In truth, sooner or later, everyone will experience times of grief and misery throughout their time on earth, however long or short that might be. We could take every precaution: exercise, diet, wear seatbelts, life jackets, helmets, use training wheels, and so forth. Still, none of these can guarantee a life free from suffering, because sooner and later, tragedy will find us. This is inevitable. This is natural. This is guaranteed. And it's how the story of my life begins. My story begins in the city of Palm Springs, California, where my parents and grandparents resided back in 1968, the year that I was born. My father had just been honorably discharged from the United States Navy after serving the war with Vietnam. During his 4.5 years of service, he'd evaded various near-death encounters, and unlike some of his fellow soldiers, he would make it back home alive. My mother had just graduated from Bakersfield High School when they had married, and right after their honeymoon, my father served an additional 4 months. Reason enough for them to celebrate a second honeymoon upon his discharge. However, affliction would soon arrive. My life began with complications from day one, and my stay at the hospital extended beyond my mother's. By all appearances, we were another normal family, suffering life's hardships like everyone else, and like many, although at the time, unbeknownst to my parents and grandparents, we were also living in this world without God, without Jesus Christ, and without the hope for salvation. Without the hope for salvation, because a people without God's direction are generations lost. By the time I turned 4, we were living in Bakersfield, California. My parents, my older sister Susan, and I. You wouldn't suspect it from our old photos, or even at that time. But behind the smiles, there was, like in many other families, hidden pain and suffering, sadness and tears. In my mother's own words, lots of them. I was completely unaware of this situation. My parents did a great job of hiding their arguments and marital problems from us, such that I do not remember a single argument between them. But the problems were there the entire time, like an iron wedge, slowly and painfully sinking into my mother's heart and my family's bond. Those hardships, that suffering, the marital problems, all gave way to great sadness, loneliness, and depression, which in turn gave birth to the contemplation of suicide, more than once. What none of us realized at the time was that even through those early hardships, God was taking care of us, because in His book, by God's benevolent grace and His immeasurable mercy, our names were already written in His everlasting story. My father, who survived through wartime, my mother, who survived as an orphan, were beginning to see their small family slowly fall apart. But as the earth kept pace and time moved forward, our time in God's perfect plan of salvation was approaching. While at war overseas, the Lord would begin His work by introducing my father to a God unlike the ones he learned of as a young boy, growing up in the Catholic faith with my grandparents. And just like the Ethiopian eunuch and Cornelius of old times, my father began to find delight in the things of the Lord, not knowing that God's blessing was now only months away. Around the age of 5, I remember attending a Bible study group with my mother. Later, I would understand that these were the first steps my parents were taking to try to save their marriage. And hoping for change, they began reading the Holy Bible with hopes that a life close to God would save their marriage. I can still recall being the only Latino family in a small Black Baptist church on Cottonwood Avenue on the south side of Bakersfield. I remember dancing down the aisle with my offering, following closely behind parishioners in their Sunday best, as the church sang with glee and their tambourines rattled joyfully. This was after my parents had tried out a local all-white Baptist church in a neighborhood on the opposite side of town, but for reasons only they know, they felt the need to continue in their search. Sadly, it wasn't the answer. Nothing they had done and tried could take away the pain and affliction in my mother's heart. It wasn't enough to change my father's ways, but change was coming. Our time was drawing near. Everything was in motion, and in such perfect order, it was fast approaching. It would unfold exactly how it was written in God's perfect plan. And before that year's end, still at the age of 5, my parents answered my grandfather's request to help with his gardening business. They decided to pack their bags and relocate to San Jacinto, California, a small town an hour and a half east of Los Angeles. But what none of my family knew was that years prior to this, God had already begun working and setting everything up for those later years. And what He was doing was not taking place in the United States. To believe in an authentic apostle of God, it's a work that only God does in the heart. For those who are included in God's perfect plan of salvation, it doesn't matter how much they ignore, reject, or even dispute God's truth, because for these, there is a specific day and time when God will do that perfect work in their heart. In the suburb of San Jose in Tepic, Mexico, God took a young 13-year-old girl and did His perfect work in her heart. Later, around her 30s, her path would cross with my grandparents, and other family members in the summer of 1972. Sister Evelia's decision to testify of her faith would be the turning point of my family's future back in 1973. But when my grandfather caught wind of Sister Evelia evangelizing his family, he threatened to have her deported back to Mexico. It was the beginning of the Light of the World Church in the city of Redlands, California, blessed by the apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ himself, Brother Samuel Joaquin Flores. And my family was moving to San Jacinto, a mere 28 miles away from where the Lord would establish another one of his early temples in Southern California. I can still remember attending a few prayers at the Martinez's house, once in their garage, another time in their small living room.